Victory lights burn across London as the war finally ends. Streets glow with celebration, windows shine again, and crowds flood public squares with relief that feels almost unreal. After years of blackout curtains and air raid sirens, people breathe freely. The sound of bells replaces the sound of bombs. To the eye, this looks like triumph. A nation battered but unbroken. An empire that endured its greatest test and survived. History often freezes here, at the moment of victory, as if the story has reached its natural conclusion. But beneath the noise and color, another reality waits in silence. Vaults sit thin and hollow. Ledgers tell a different story. The war may be over, but something vital is already slipping away. We are taught that the Second World War saved Britain, that it forged an unbreakable alliance and confirmed Britain's place among the architects of the modern world. The familiar story says sacrifice led to strength and unity led to renewal. Yet this version skips the cost that did not explode or burn. The real damage arrived quietly, through paper and ink, through contracts signed in desperation, and promises made under pressure. Britain did not begin losing its empire when soldiers came home. It began losing it while the fighting still raged, when survival mattered more than control. The battlefield was not only land and sea, it was finance. Imagine the position Britain faced in those early years of war, cut off from normal trade, bombed to home, fighting on multiple fronts. An empire built on global commerce suddenly starved of cash. Factories needed raw materials. Armies needed equipment. Civilians needed food. All of it required payment. But the reserves that once backed Britain's power were draining fast. Gold flowed out. Overseas income slowed. What could not be paid for in cash had to be paid for later. Think about that. An empire that once set the rules of money now had to ask for time. This is where the story turns uncomfortable. To keep fighting, Britain turned to credit, not as a strategy, but as a necessity. Emergency agreements replaced normal trade. Supplies arrived not because Britain could pay, but because someone else could afford to wait. Each shipment carried relief and risk. Each deal pushed the problem forward. In the moment, these choices felt unavoidable. Without them, the war could be lost. Yet every borrowed dollar, every deferred payment, quietly shifted the balance of power. Debt does not announce itself as defeat. It disguises itself as survival. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Warships still crossed the oceans. Colonial flags still flew. Officials spoke with confidence. The empire looked intact. That illusion mattered, because power depends on belief as much as force. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. Emergency meetings replaced long-term planning. Accountants gained influence once held by admirals. Decisions once guided by imperial ambition were now guided by cash flow. The question was no longer how to shape the post-war world, but how to pay for the present one. This story is not about betrayal. It is not about secret plots or hidden enemies. It is about leverage and how quickly it changes hands when money runs out. In war, time becomes the most valuable currency. Britain bought time by selling tomorrow. The cost was not clear in the moment because the alternative was unthinkable. Losing the war would mean everything. So the empire accepted terms it would once have rejected without hesitation. It accepted oversight where it once demanded autonomy. It accepted dependence where it once dictated policy. These choices did not feel like surrender. They felt like endurance. Listen closely to the silence after the celebrations fade. The cheering crowds disperse. Factories slow. Soldiers demobilize. But the bills remain. Wartime finance does not end with peace. It waits. Interest accumulates. Obligations mature. What was framed as temporary becomes permanent. Britain entered the war as a financial leader. It emerged as a debtor. That shift mattered more than any lost battle, because it reshaped every decision that followed. Power now required permission. The danger of debt is not just repayment. It is influence. Creditors do not need to threaten. They only need to wait. When currencies wobble, when reserves thin, when trade must resume, the lender holds the calmest hand. Think about that. An empire that once controlled markets now depended on access to them. An empire that once dictated terms now negotiated from weakness, even if it refused to admit it publicly. This is why the collapse did not look like collapse at first. There were no sudden evacuations, no single declaration that the empire was over. Instead, there were adjustments, reforms, temporary measures that quietly reduced control, each one justified, each one small. Together, they formed a pattern. Wartime finance became peacetime constraint. The tools used to survive the war became the chains that limited the future. Look again at those victory lights. They shine over a nation that believes the hardest part is over. In truth, the most important struggle is just beginning. Not a struggle for territory, but for autonomy. Not a struggle against enemies, but against arithmetic. Britain won the war. But victory does not erase imbalance. It exposes it. The empire still exists, but its center of gravity has shifted. Decisions that once originated in London now require approval elsewhere, even if that approval is framed as cooperation. This chapter asks a single question, and everything that follows grows from it. What happens when the world's largest empire must borrow to stay alive, and the lender quietly learns how to collect? The answer is not immediate. It unfolds over years. It reshapes alliances. It accelerates independence movements. It redefines what power looks like in the modern world. The war ended with fireworks. The reckoning arrived with invoices. And history, focused on victory parades, almost missed the moment when the empire began to bleed from within. The story ahead follows that bleed. It traces how emergency decisions became structural limits, and how finance exceeded where force could not. This is the hidden cost of survival, the price of staying in the fight. Britain did not fall in battle. It adjusted, compromised, and adapted until the empire it once ruled could no longer exist in the same form. The lights of victory masked the shadows of dependence, and in those shadows, the future was already being written. Before the war, Britain looked unbreakable. Its power felt permanent, almost natural, as if the global system itself had been designed to keep London at its center. The pound moved markets far beyond Britain's shores. Insurance, shipping, and finance flowed through institutions that had grown over generations. Trade routes formed a vast web, guarded by naval strength and reinforced by habit. Colonies supplied raw materials. Factories transformed them into finished goods. Profits returned home. It was a rhythm so familiar that few questioned its endurance. Even when warning signs appeared, they were dismissed as temporary disruptions. Britain had weathered storms before. This one, many believed, would pass the same way. The empire's confidence rested on history. It had survived previous wars, previous debts, previous economic shocks. Each time, it emerged altered but intact. The system bent but did not break. That past success bred a dangerous assumption that survival itself proved inevitability. When tensions rose across Europe, Britain prepared as it always had, drawing on reserves of experience and reputation. Diplomacy, deterrence, and limited mobilization seemed sufficient. The empire did not see itself as fragile. It saw itself as tested. When war finally arrived, it arrived everywhere at once. Sea lanes became battlefields. Skies filled with bombers. Factories shifted from consumer goods to weapons almost overnight. Britain mobilized with speed and determination, pulling resources from every corner of its empire. Labor was redirected. Production schedules were rewritten. The machinery of war roared to life. For a time, the system appeared to work. Ships sailed. Armies deployed. Resistance held. From the outside, Britain looked resolute, even defiant. The illusion of strength held firm. But illusions are expensive. Keeping factories running required imported materials. Feeding the population required uninterrupted supply. Replacing destroyed equipment demanded constant output. All of this required payment, and payment required liquidity. That was the pressure point. Britain's economy had been strong, but was not built for total war without cost. Overseas investments were sold. Gold reserves declined. Foreign earnings slowed as trade routes closed or came under attack. Each measure bought time, but reduced flexibility. The empire was spending its stored power faster than it could replace it. As the conflict deepened, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Public messaging emphasized resilience. Private conversations focused on solvency. Britain could still fight, but it could no longer fight cheaply. War was no longer just a test of will. It was a test of balance sheets. The empire faced a dilemma it had rarely confronted so directly. Either reduce its war effort and risk defeat, or find new ways to pay for survival. There was little room for pride in that calculation. This is where the United States entered the story in a new role, not as a combatant at first, but as an industrial powerhouse watching events unfold from relative safety. Its factories were intact, its resources abundant, its economy expanding rather than contracting. While Britain strained under bombardment, the United States scaled up production at a distance. Supplies accumulated. Capacity grew. When Britain turned outward for assistance, the answer came swiftly, and it came with structure. At first, the arrangement looked simple. Britain needed supplies. The United States had them. Goods flowed across the Atlantic. Food, fuel, machinery, and weapons arrived in steady streams. The narrative presented this as partnership, as shared purpose. Crowds saw crates unloaded and felt reassurance. The war effort continued. The alliance appeared equal, built on trust and common values. But economics does not operate on sentiment. It operates on terms. Britain was no longer paying in full. It was paying in promises. The difference mattered. Each shipment represented deferred cost. Each agreement postponed settlement. The United States recorded these obligations carefully, not as charity, but as assets. In the moment, this distinction seemed minor. After all, the priority was victory. Future accounting could wait. Yet future accounting was exactly what gave these arrangements their power. The imbalance was being documented even as it was being justified. The illusion of strength persisted because Britain still commanded force. Its navy still sailed. Its army still fought. Control on the ground masked vulnerability on the page. But the center of gravity was shifting. Financial decisions began to shape strategic ones. What could be afforded influenced what could be attempted. Risk tolerance narrowed. Long-term planning gave way to crisis management. The empire was no longer choosing freely. It was choosing from what it could still pay for. Inside government offices, the tone changed. Conversations once framed around imperial reach were reframed around sustainability. How long could reserves last? Which assets could be liquidated without public panic? Which obligations could be delayed? These were not questions of defeat. They were questions of endurance. But endurance has limits, and those limits were now being set externally. Dependence crept in not through conquest, but through coordination. The United States, meanwhile, gained experience and influence without occupation. It learned how to shape outcomes through supply and access. There was no need for overt control. The imbalance itself did the work. When one side needs goods urgently and the other can afford patience, the relationship is already defined. This was not malicious. It was structural. The war rewarded capacity and punished exposure. Britain had exposure everywhere. The empire still appeared tall, but its foundation was under stress. Colonies were asked to contribute more, even as Britain's ability to support them weakened. Resources flowed outward. Returns slowed. Questions began to surface quietly. If Britain could not finance its own survival, what did that mean for its authority? These doubts did not erupt immediately, but they accumulated. Confidence eroded in places far from London, where imperial power had always relied on perception as much as presence. The crucial detail is that none of this felt like collapse at the time. It felt like adaptation. Britain was doing what it had always done, adjusting to circumstance. But this adjustment was different. It reduced independence rather than preserving it. The empire was trading flexibility for stability, autonomy for assurance. These trades made sense individually. Together, they changed the nature of power. By the later years of the war, the pattern was clear to those willing to see it. Britain could still act, but only within narrowing financial boundaries. The United States could wait. It could afford to think about the post-war world, while Britain focused on the next shipment. This difference in perspective would matter profoundly once the fighting stopped. The alliance was real, but it was no longer symmetrical. This chapter is about illusion, and why illusion can be more dangerous than weakness. Britain's strength masked its vulnerability long enough to commit it to a path it could not easily leave. The empire believed it was surviving the war intact. In reality, it was reshaping itself into something more constrained. The war did not break Britain. It revealed the cost of holding everything together at once. Think about that. An empire can appear strong even as it mortgages its future. It can win battles while losing options. It can preserve territory while surrendering leverage. By the time the illusion fades, the structure beneath has already changed. Britain entered the war as a financial anchor of the global system. It moved through the war as a dependent partner. The difference was subtle in the moment. It would become undeniable after the silence returned. The stage is now set. The illusion of permanence has done its work. The empire stands, but it stands on borrowed ground. What comes next is not dramatic in the way wars are dramatic. It unfolds through spreadsheets, negotiations, and conditions. The real turning point is still ahead, and it will arrive not with explosions, but with realization. The cracks widen without noise. There were no sirens, no public announcements, no dramatic turning points that newspapers could headline. Instead, the shift happened in offices filled with paper, in meetings where urgency replaced pride. Wartime agreements that had once seemed temporary began to harden into structure. Cash was replaced by credit. Gold was replaced by promises. What had started as emergency support slowly transformed into obligation. Britain was no longer just fighting a war. It was financing one with its future. During the conflict, borrowing felt abstract. Supplies arrived when they were needed. Ships unloaded food, fuel, and equipment. The immediate crisis was always tomorrow's shortage, not next decade's cost. But every delivery carried an invisible ledger entry. Every deferred payment became a claim. Britain financed the war by pledging exports it had not yet produced, earnings it had not yet collected, influence it had not yet surrendered. The empire was trading certainty later for survival now. Think about that. Survival always feels priceless until the bill arrives. The United States, sheltered from destruction and driven by industrial expansion, emerged from the war in a radically different position. Its factories ran at full capacity. Its reserves grew. While Britain rationed and rebuilt under bombardment, American production surged without interruption. This contrast mattered more than ideology or goodwill. One nation was exhausting itself. The other was accumulating capacity. Power followed the flow of resources, not the rhetoric of alliance. By the war's end, the imbalance was no longer theoretical. Britain owed more than it could easily repay. Overseas obligations stacked up, frozen in accounts that could not be cleared without destabilizing the currency. Sterling, once a symbol of global reliability, became a constraint. It could not move freely. It could not be converted without consequence. Britain discovered that debt does not just demand repayment. It dictates behavior. This was a turning point, and it arrived quietly. When peace came, Britain expected relief. Instead, it faced arithmetic. The war was over, but the emergency economy remained. Export earnings were needed to pay debts, not to rebuild a home. Currency stability required discipline, not ambition. Decisions that once would have been domestic now had international implications. Financial independence had narrowed to a corridor, and stepping outside it risked collapse. Aid arrived, but aid is never neutral. Assistance came with expectations, conditions, and oversight. Stability required cooperation. Cooperation required concessions. These were framed as reasonable, even responsible, and they were. That is what made them so effective. Britain was not forced into submission. It was guided into alignment. The difference is subtle but decisive. Influence exercised through necessity leaves no visible scars, only lasting limits. Markets adjusted faster than governments. Investors followed confidence, and confidence followed liquidity. Britain's ability to shape global finance weakened as other centers gained prominence. Where London once dictated terms, it now negotiated them. Trade agreements reflected new realities. Currency arrangements favored stability over dominance. Britain remained influential, but no longer central. The world had learned how to function without automatic deference to imperial finance. Colonies noticed this shift long before formal announcements acknowledged it. Imperial authority had always rested on two pillars: force and confidence. When confidence cracked, force alone was not enough. If Britain could not control its own currency, how could it guarantee theirs? If Britain had to ask permission to stabilize its economy, what did imperial protection truly mean? These questions spread quietly, then openly. Economic weakness travels faster than political reform. Inside Britain, the consequences accumulated. Factories slowed as resources were redirected towards servicing obligations. Ships were sold to raise funds. Overseas assets were liquidated, not as strategy, but as necessity. Each sale reduced long-term leverage. Each adjustment narrowed future options. This was not mismanagement. It was triage. Britain was keeping itself upright by shedding weight, even as that weight had once been the source of its power. The collapse did not come as a single event. It came as a pattern. One agreement followed another. One exception became precedent. One temporary measure became permanent policy. Ledgers replaced cannons as instruments of power. Balance sheets mattered more than battleships. The empire had not been conquered. It had been priced. Think about the nature of this shift. Military defeat creates resistance. Financial dependence creates compliance. When survival depends on stability, and stability depends on cooperation, resistance becomes irrational. Britain adjusted because adjustment was the only viable option. That adjustment reshaped its role in the world. The empire could no longer act independently without risking economic crisis. Influence now flowed through negotiation, not command. This mechanism explains why the end felt anticlimactic. There was no dramatic fall, no final stand. The empire receded through administrative decisions and economic reforms. Each one justified, each one reasonable. Together, they marked the end of an era. Britain was still present, still respected, still capable, but it was no longer dominant. The war had transformed it from architect to participant. The most important realization arrived not with policy change, but with acceptance. Britain understood that the old system could not be restored. The financial structure built during the war now defined peacetime limits. Returning to pre-war dominance was not just unrealistic, it was impossible. The world had moved on, guided by new centers of capital and new rules of access. Britain could either resist and fracture or adapt and endure. It chose endurance. This choice preserved stability, but it came at a cost. Endurance required letting go. It required acknowledging that empire was no longer sustainable under the new economic order. The tools that had once supported global control now imposed restraint. Debt had accomplished what force could not. It had reshaped incentives, redirected priorities, and rewritten authority. Look back at the war years and the choices made under pressure. None of them were foolish. None of them were malicious. They were rational responses to existential threat. That is what makes this story so unsettling. The mechanisms that dismantled the empire were built by necessity, not mistake. Britain survived by doing what made sense at the time. The consequences unfolded later. By the time these consequences became visible, reversal was no longer an option. The system had locked into place. Financial dependence had matured into structural reality. Britain could manage decline, but it could not escape it. The empire's fate was no longer decided by strategy, but by settlement schedules and exchange constraints. Power had shifted, and it would not shift back. This chapter is where the story pivots from illusion to understanding. The war did not simply weaken Britain. It redefined what strength meant. Strength now belonged to those who control liquidity, production, and access. Those who could afford patience. Those who could wait while others adjusted. Britain learned this lesson not in defeat, but in victory. The guns fell silent, but the numbers kept speaking. They spoke of limits, of obligations, of a world no longer anchored to imperial finance. The empire did not fall apart. It was taken apart, piece by arithmetic. And once that process began, no speech or symbol could stop it. The turning point had passed. The ledger was now in control. When you step back and view the whole mechanism, the pattern becomes clear. Wartime finance did not merely support the war. It reshaped the peace. It redistributed power without firing a shot. It turned alliance into hierarchy and necessity into leverage. Britain's decline was not dramatic. It was methodical, and by the time it was fully understood, it was already complete. This is the moment when history often looks away, because nothing appears to happen. But this is where everything changes. The empire still stands, but it stands on different terms. The war has ended. The reckoning has begun. The aftermath did not arrive with a crash. It arrived with adjustments. Files were reorganized. Policies were revised. Committees replaced commands. Britain woke up after the war to a world that looked familiar on the surface, but operated on different rules underneath. Independence movements accelerated not because Britain suddenly lost authority, but because it could no longer afford to enforce it everywhere at once. Bases closed quietly. Garrisons were reduced. Administrative control was transferred, then surrendered, often framed as orderly transition rather than retreat. The empire did not end in chaos. It dissolved through paperwork. At home, the priorities shifted from dominance to recovery. Cities needed rebuilding. Industry needed modernization. People expected peace to deliver stability. But stability required resources, and resources were constrained by commitments made during wartime. Britain had to export to earn, but earnings went first obligations. Domestic needs competed with external payments. Every policy choice became a balancing act. Ambition narrowed. Prudence ruled. The empire that once planned decades ahead now planned budgets. Abroad, the financial architecture built during the war began to define peacetime reality. Institutions replaced empires as a framework of order. Influence moved through loans, trade access, and currency arrangements rather than flags. The pound no longer anchored the system. Another currency took that role, not by conquest, but by capacity. Britain adjusted to this new structure because adjustment was the only option that preserved stability. Resistance would have meant isolation. Isolation would have meant collapse. This transition reshaped Britain's identity. It remained influential, experienced, respected, but it was no longer the final arbiter. Decisions required coordination. Authority required consensus. Where Britain once imposed terms, it now negotiated them. This was not humiliation. It was reclassification. Britain moved from center to pillar, from controller to contributor. The loss was not immediate, but it was permanent. The colonies understood this shift instinctively. Imperial power had always relied on the promise of protection and prosperity. When that promise weakened, loyalty followed. Independence movements framed their demands in economic language as much as political language. Control over currency, control over trade, control over development. Britain, constrained by its own financial limits, could not offer the guarantees it once did. Decolonization accelerated not just because of ideology, but because the empire could no longer afford delay. Look closely at how orderly this process was. There were negotiations, handovers, ceremonies. The world praised Britain for managing decline responsibly. And it did. That is part of the lesson. Empires do not always fall screaming. Sometimes they step back carefully, choosing stability over pride. Britain chose continuity over confrontation. It preserved alliances by accepting limits. That choice avoided disaster, but confirmed the end of imperial autonomy. Think about what was lost and what was gained. Britain avoided economic collapse. It secured a place in the new order. It maintained relevance. But it surrendered the freedom to act alone on a global scale. That freedom had been mortgaged during the war, one shipment at a time. Wartime finance had done its work. The empire had been reshaped from the inside, not by force, but by necessity. This is why the story matters beyond Britain. The mechanism did not belong to one country or one era. It is a pattern. Wars concentrate power where production and liquidity reside. Nations that fight on credit survive the conflict, but emerge constrained. Allies become managers. Assistance becomes structure. Independence becomes conditional. The battlefield ends. The accounting continues. In the modern world, this logic still governs outcomes. Financial systems outlast wars. Emergency measures become permanent frameworks. Decisions made under pressure define decades. The language changes, but the mechanism remains. Stability is rewarded. Dependence is managed. Sovereignty becomes negotiable when liquidity disappears. Britain's experience is not unique. It is simply clear. The empire's end is often remembered as moral progress, and in many ways it was. Self-rule expanded. Old hierarchies collapsed. But the economic dimension is just as important. Britain did not choose to abandon empire because it lost belief in it. It abandoned empire because it lost the ability to finance it. Belief without resources is sentiment. Power without liquidity is memory. Imagine an empire undone not by invasion, but by balance sheets. No burning capitals. No final siege. Just spreadsheets that no longer balance. Obligations that no longer fit ambition. This is a quiet end that history rarely dramatizes, but always repeats. When the cheering stops and the flags are folded away, what remains is arithmetic. Britain's story closes not in failure, but in warning. Strength without financial independence is temporary. Victory without liquidity is conditional. Alliances formed in crisis reshape hierarchy long after crisis ends. Think about that. The most decisive battles are often fought far from the front lines, in rooms where numbers decide futures. This documentary has traced how wartime finance destroyed an empire from within, not through betrayal or incompetence, but through rational choices made under extreme pressure. Britain survived by borrowing. It endured by adjusting. It declined by necessity. The war was won. The empire was not preserved. If you want to understand power in the modern world, you have to look beyond speeches and symbols. You have to follow the money. You have to ask who can wait and who cannot, who pays now and who pays later. History rewards those questions. If this story changed how you see empires, war, and power, subscribe for more deep explorations into the hidden economics of history. And if you believe these lessons matter today, share this documentary so others can see how the world is really shaped.